Hi, and thank you so much for joining this session at JNUC 2022. I'm excited to talk to you about the two things that I care about the most in my job as a digital workplace architect: user experience and security. Two things that many see as impossible to combine, but I do disagree. Conditional access play an essential role in being successful with both. My name is Simon and I work as a digital workplace architect at Telia Cygate, and my goal is always to ensure that users are happy by eliminating disturbance. I'm a Microsoft MVP, that's Most Valuable Professional within Enterprise Mobility, a Microsoft Certified Trainer, and this is the third time I've been invited to speak at JNUC. I live outside of Linköping, Sweden, 2 hours south of Stockholm, and the city is best known for its chocolate factory and its fighter jet factory. Please feel free to follow me on Twitter, connect on LinkedIn, or listen to the podcast Knee Deep in Tech. Also ensure to catch my second JNUC session, that's 1117, which will help you and your organization to embrace macOS as a first-class operating system within your organization. And with that, time to get going. Security in general, and IT security in particular, is dependent on that we can trust the identities of the people we collaborate with. We need to understand how a particular identity is to be used, and to investigate when an individual, a device, a system, or any other kind of identity is being used in a way that it was not intended for. And mostly, the reasons for an improper or bad usage of an identity isn't malicious. In many cases, it can be a mistake, an incorrect permission, or a will to perform a task that a colleague has been assigned to do. But sometimes, it is something more severe. A malicious or criminal usage where the goal is to negatively affect your organization. Because of this, many organizations are striving towards a zero trust strategy. I won't go into detail on what zero trust is or isn't. That is a session in itself. But to me, one of the key aspects of zero trust is the thought of conditional access. In this session, we'll focus on how we integrate Jamf Pro with Microsoft Intune to leverage Microsoft's conditional access solution. However, conditional access is also a concept, which I will explain in just a few minutes. Today, we'll start by explaining the concept of conditional access, how Jamf Pro, Microsoft Intune, and Azure AD integrate with each other, and a brief walkthrough of how to integrate the tools. Once this is done, we will dive into conditional access and the do's and don'ts of it. I will ensure that you understand the technical limits of the solution and ensure that you avoid the most common mistakes that I've seen within organizations I've helped. And finally, I will share the vision of how this integration is just the first step towards your zero trust journey, and how you can leverage these learnings to extend even further with Jamf, Microsoft, Apple, and other partners. When you have finished watching this session, you will understand what threats and techniques conditional access does and does not protect you against. You have learned how to configure conditional access within Jamf Pro and Microsoft Intune in a secure, manageable, and efficient way, and how to avoid common mistakes. And finally, you will be inspired to first and foremost start this journey, since many of you likely work within organizations where you have access to these solutions today, with Jamf Pro and Microsoft Intune, but also continue above and beyond these basic configurations and ensure that conditional access is a core component for your organization's zero trust strategy. We will start by defining the meaning of conditional access before we head into the technology. The word conditional is defined as something that is subject to one or more conditions or requirements being met, while the word access have two definitions. The more general, the means or opportunity to approach or enter a place, or more commonly within IT, obtain or retrieve a computer, some kind of data, or a file. So combined, it would be something like this, and I will give you a few seconds to read it. This also gives us the three groups of variables we need to define within our conditional access solution for Jamf Pro and Microsoft Intune. First, we have conditions. Given one or more conditions, which can be anything like location, kind of device, application, group membership, etc., what are the requirements that can be multi-factor, it can be different kinds of access solutions, compliance, which we will focus on today, that an individual and or a device need to fulfill to get access to a certain kind of data. And data can be a system, an app, a file, or something else. With these three, we will take a quick look at Microsoft Conditional Access solutions and how to integrate it with Jamf Pro, and then let's head into the demos. So the first demo will explain the different settings, which defines the conditions, requirements, and data for each conditional access policy. This is also where we, under requirements, can require a compliant device, which is what the integration between Jamf Pro and Microsoft Intune really is all about. Here we have our new policy. It does not look too complicated, but each section contains a number of different options. First, we start by targeting the users or workloads that, if they fulfill the conditions, will evaluate the policy. You can call this part of the conditions, but do note that both this as well as compliance policy, which we will look at shortly, is user targeted only. Under conditions, we find, lo and behold, conditions. And as you can see, they include a number of configurations in terms of device platforms, network locations, and also the option to filter based on certain device attributes. Note again, because we will get back to this later, that only users that are targeted and fulfill the requirements will be subject to this policy. Then under access control, we find grant, which is the requirements that a user needs to fulfill to be allowed access to the data. Here we find everything from being a compliant device, which is common, especially with the Jamf Pro and Microsoft Intune integration, and requiring multi-factor authentication or accepting terms of use. We can also decide if we require one or more of these grant controls before allowing access. Finally, we have the cloud apps or actions, which is where we can specify the data or a task that the user wants access to. The most common selection here is one or more cloud applications, but it can also be used to protect registration within an MDM or protecting a password reset. And as you can see, the combinations are almost endless. And I have seen few implementations of conditional access that have been correctly configured from the start. It can be very complicated, especially in larger organizations. Therefore, Microsoft have provided us with an what-if tool that allows us to evaluate the conditions and targeting before putting them into production. So next up is a brief walkthrough of the configuration you need to complete before Jamf Pro will start to communicate the compliance state of a managed macOS or iOS device to Microsoft Intune. So within the Jamf Pro console, you head to Global Settings, and you start with Conditional Access. You can also see that we have device compliance, and that is for iOS, and it follows a similar pattern that we will show now when we focus on macOS. So for most environments, once you have headed into the Conditional Access node, Cloud Connect will be the best choice, and just leave the rest at the default selection. For environments where you, as a Jamf admin, do not have permissions required in Azure AD to complete this task, but need an identity admin to do so, the manual options is well documented as well. And this page is the one, soon followed by a similar one, that might be challenging to accept for some of you and might require you to use a manual configuration. When going through this wizard with a global admin account within Azure AD, 2 enterprise applications will be created for you within Azure AD. This page and the next is required to accept the permissions that each app is configured to use. The one you can see here is the one that will send the device information from Jamf Pro to Microsoft Intune. But it also requires to read your Azure Active Directory to connect this application with the user identity that we are targeting with these policies. The second one is to ensure that the registration that needs to take place of the device can be successful and where compliance data can be connected to that user object. Do remember, it is the user that is the target. The device will just send its information to Microsoft Intune for evaluation, and we'll soon talk a little bit more about that. Once the permissions have been accepted, Jamf Pro will ensure to populate Microsoft Intune with the correct app ID to set up the connection. And shortly after that, you should see an active connection status, and that device objects from Jamf Pro will start to show within Microsoft Intune with their compliance status. For more information about the flow and what needs to happen on the device, please refer to the Jamf Pro and/or Microsoft's documentation. Now, it is time to head into a couple of demos describing how you, in my opinion, should use conditional access and some common misconfigurations that other organizations have made, sometimes with catastrophic results. Let's start with explaining compliant device that I've been mentioning and referring to since the start of this session, and how to configure it. In this picture, you can see that I have a number of compliance policies configured. I usually break them up on a per setting or per category basis to better be able to communicate to users when something isn't configured as it should on their device. As an example, if I have a compliance policy that requires them to have a passcode of at least 14 characters, and it is not, this policy can then send an email to them and explain that this is what you're violating, please fix it. But for a device to be considered compliant, it needs to fulfill all the policies that are targeted to that user that's trying to access the data from a particular device. So let's say that I use multiple devices and I'm targeted with multiple compliance policies. Every time I use a device, the compliance policy will be evaluated. If it's a managed device, it will be able to recognize if it is compliant or not. If it's an unmanaged device, it will automatically be seen as an unmanaged device. But it will always follow me, which I think makes a lot of sense, because I shouldn't have different rule sets dependent on which device I use. I should always fulfill the same kind of requirements to access the same app regardless of what device I choose to use. And this is essential both for Jamf Pro and Microsoft Intune, since it requires you to target that user, not the device, with these policies. And some common examples of compliance policies is to require Key Vault to be turned on, to have a specific version of Mac OS or a later version than the one you specify, or that the device is running some kind of active anti-malware or a password that I just described. And again, if I have multiple policies, the device needs to fulfill every single one of them to be considered compliant. Now, this is rather straightforward, but do remember that compliance usually are only evaluated every 8 hours. So it isn't instant or evaluated continuously. It's not what you should use to instantly grant or revoke access to a network, but it can be part of that, which we'll talk about later. But before we move forward, I would also like you to show a key configuration that a lot of organizations are, in my opinion, configuring in the wrong way. The highlighted setting is usually enabled. That means that if a user is not targeted by any compliance policies, all devices that they will use will by default, as long as they are managed, be seen as compliant. And I would highly recommend you to configure it in according to this screenshot, that if a user isn't targeted by any compliance policy, all the devices that it logs onto or tries to access an application from should be considered as non-compliant. And the reason for this is that it ensures that mistakes in targeting do not negatively impact your security configuration. So with this next demo, I will explain the most common mistakes I find within environments that I assess and how you can get started or continue your conditional access implementation. It is first and foremost essential to understand that conditional access do not work as a firewall, and I will give you an example of that. And this is only an example, but something I've found in numerous environments. This administrator have intended to only allow the group knee-deep in tech to access any cloud app. The administrator also wants to ensure that all users within the knee-deep in tech group that they should use multi-factor authentication before they are allowed access. In a firewall, this would have worked as intended. But what happens if a user within this organization's Azure AD tries to access a cloud app with their account, and that account is not a member of the knee-deep in tech group? Well, all users not in the knee-deep in tech group will be allowed access to that cloud app without any MFA. So for the above example to work, the administrator would also have to configure a block policy that targets all the users and excludes the knee-deep in tech group. This is incredibly common, and especially in environments with high requirements on granularity, this will get complicated very, very fast. Especially when having a lot of conditions combined and a variety of different operating systems. To avoid that, I want to give you two additional resources that I use in most of my implementations today. First, Microsoft are now providing a number of templates that you can use to configure policies in accordance with their recommendations. You're of course able to configure them to your organization's needs and your groups, but it's certainly a good start. Do not, however, implement them all at once and without understanding what they do first. Also note that some of these policies require a higher Microsoft 365 license than some of the others. And the ones that I'm referring to now are the ones that require Azure AD Premium P2 licenses. Many of you probably have an Azure AD P1 license, and feel free to throw questions in the chat if you would like me to answer if you have that or not. But the P2 is usually a higher SKU, so some of these might not work. But talk to your license partner and they will gladly help you. So that was the first one. The second one, and no, this QR code is not malicious, I assure you. My MVP colleague Daniel Kronlund have a fantastic conditional access baseline that goes beyond what Microsoft offers today. It is also built to allow for a fully automated deployment and maintenance over time. So you can basically do infrastructure as code with conditional access. And especially in larger environments or where you want to move from a test tenant to a production tenant, this is a fantastic solution to use. So I highly recommend you to take a look at his solution. And with these two template libraries, you should be able to get a solid foundation to stand on and build your security configuration on. So, as with compliance policies, it is good practice to have multiple conditional access policies that combines. This can also make it harder to understand and evaluate exactly what will happen. So let's take a look at an example. Let's use the what if feature that I mentioned previously to evaluate this scenario. As you can see, here we have selected my user that wants to access Microsoft Intune from a Mac OS device. The user, according to Azure AD Identity Protection that I mentioned previously, also have a medium risk score. With this input, let's see which of these conditions that triggers which requirements. So the result of this is actually that 5 different policies will apply simultaneously. Do, however, note that since we didn't specify information for all of the conditions that are evaluated, such as legacy authentication, Some of these policies will only apply if those conditions are fulfilled. But as we can see here, is that one policy, the one for high-risk users, would block access. Two policies would require multi-factor authentication, and one that is in a report-only state would require the user to accept a terms of use policy. First, block always wins. So if a policy says block, the user won't get access, regardless if they fulfill everything else. The rest of these conditions will be combined. So here the user would both get asked for a multi-factor authentication as well as to accept the terms of use. The user would, however, not get more than one MFA prompt. So this is important to remember in your design work, and something that I often find organizations are doing overly complicated. So, as with the compliance policies, do separate your policies into different grant requirements, into different condition evaluations, and look at the bigger picture. What are we trying to achieve under which circumstances, and how will this impact the user? Especially with iOS, this is even more important because there we also have a much more granular control over which app a certain user are allowed to use to access a certain kind of data. So, for the final bit of this session, I want to inspire you with what I see as the next step for all of you that have integrated Jamf Pro and Microsoft Intune, and hopefully also for the ones of you that will be doing that after this session. Conditional access to me is just a piece of something bigger, where Jamf Pro plays a key role. This is an example of a zero trust design, where conditional access is being used to protect the initial access to the network or the cloud applications. But the information we gather as part of this process, the compliance state, the user state, the device it signs in from, the location, everything that conditional access can evaluate and Jamf Pro can provide to conditional access, that information can be part of this process that can later be used for many other parts of the security framework within the organization. Especially with the combination of Jamf and Apple, integrations with Cisco network hardware and solutions are especially powerful and support the entire framework of vendors. So in the end, the integration between Jamf Pro and Microsoft Intune, as well as the integrations between Jamf Connect and Azure AD, or Jamf Protect and Azure Sentinel, is just the beginning. You need to ensure that the vendors your organizations choose to work with integrates well, that integrations do work across the entire estate and have a common data model. It's absolute key for a secure infrastructure and organization. I always recommend to prioritize integrations and that entire picture rather than trying to get best of breed products that do not integrate well with each other. So who benefits from these integrations and a cross-silo security strategy? First, IT wins by not fighting internal battles and falling over each other's heads in the desire to do good. The users wins because they spend less amount of time on fulfilling security controls, and they get a higher degree of security when we target each app or each piece of data with the appropriate security configurations instead of trying to find a one-size-fits-all. But most essentially, the organization wins. Less money are spent on useless security tools that are already in place somewhere else. And that money can go into reaching the goals of the organization instead. Now, it's time to summarize. This is a picture from my very first JNUC talk, where I talked about Jamf Pro and Microsoft Intune, a match made in the cloud. That is still true, and it's still important, and it's easier than ever before. To quote Boromir from Lord of the Rings, we have conditional access. Why not use it? Don't see conditional access just as another security solution. Use it together with all of your other Jamf solutions to create a powerful integration and a stronger security posture. Integration and cooperation is key, not to have best-of-breed solutions that do not speak to each other. Never assume, always verify. That goes for Zero Trust, conditional access, and for your own environment. I am no different from anyone in this virtual room. We all make mistakes. We all get blind within our own environment. So continuously during your journey with conditional access, let others review your configuration. Things are constantly changing, and there might be unexpected benefits or unknown weak spots. You now have a better understanding of the threats you can prevent and the techniques you need to master to be successful with Jamf Pro, Microsoft Intune, and conditional access. To set and maintain a strong configuration is absolute key, and it never stops. We constantly get new capabilities, we will constantly get new requirements, but the application landscape are also continuously changing. A configuration that were strong yesterday might be weak today, and you now know how to create a robust base for this. And finally, you can soon disconnect from this session and go back to your organization and explain to them how Jamf fits into the bigger Zero Trust strategy of your organization, how it is a benefit, an essential part of your IT security posture. You can go above and beyond, but to do that, you need to first go deep and get that understanding of the tools you have. A tool in the wrong hands can pose a greater risk than what it might benefit you to learn it. But when you know how to combine this leading macOS management toolset together with a leader within identity protection and conditional access, you can really reach new heights and a stronger, more robust, and more user-friendly security posture. Thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions following in this session, and enjoy the rest of your JNUC. Thank you.